Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the very kind welcome. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's really, really good to be with you today. And I do so as the Chief Executive of one of Britain's largest children's charities, but also as a school governor of a fabulous high school in Hampshire. So I want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart for all that you do to serve schools and communities and serve young people, particularly through the most unprecedented and unparalleled couple of years that we've been through. You'll be delighted to know that we support our staff to be governors of schools. We give them time off to do so. We've got a school governors network within our organisation, and we do all we can to share learning from all of our governors across schools. And I hope that makes us a model employer for school governors. Before I open the Good Childhood Report 2022, let me tell you a little bit about the organisation that I have the privilege to lead. We started 141 years ago in Vauxhall in South London. Back then, an area of immense deprivation and poverty. Today it's 9 Elms. It's the American Embassy. It's luxury flats. They've probably all been locked up because they probably belong to Russian oligarchs. But back in the day, it was an area of immense deprivation and poverty. And we were founded by a young man called Edward Rudolph, who had a Sunday school class in a wee Anglican church just there, which is still there, called St. Anne's and All Saints. And there was one Sunday morning that Rudolph noticed there were 2 little boys hadn't turned up. And he wondered where they were, and he went looking for them. And he found them sitting on the corner of a street in South London begging. It turned out their father had died the night before, their mum had no money, and she sent these 2 children out to beg. Steve Jobs, who founded the Apple empire, said some of the world's greatest vision is born in the greatest anger. It's only truly when you're cross about something that you're determined to work out how to solve it. And I believe Edward Rudolph was filled with rage. In fact, I know he was, because he stormed off down the road to Lambeth Palace and banged on the gate and demanded to see the Archbishop of Canterbury. And he told him about these 2 children. He said, "What are you going to do about it?" And the Archbishop said, "What are you going to do about it?" And that was the moment we were born. Now, we weren't called the Children's Society back then. We were called the Society of Waifs and Strays. We have subsequently rebranded over the years to become the Children's Society. And I often wonder, as the 12th successor to Edward Rudolph, I often wonder what he would make of it if he walked in today to our offices around the country, into one of our 78 services supporting 50,000 children, or if he walked into one of our 106 shops raising £12 million a year to support our work. What would he make? Well, I think he'd think 2 things. I think firstly he'd go, flippin' heck, something I started. Wow, look what it's grown into, this movement of people with nearly 800 staff and thousands of volunteers and 134,000 supporters. But I dare to believe Edward Rudolph would be more angry today than he was in 1881. I think he might have thought by 2022 children's lives would be getting easier in this country and not harder. Do you know there are more children proportionately in that part of London today in poverty than there was when my organisation was started 141 years ago? There are 4 million kids in this country living in poverty. So 141 years later, I think Rudolph would be more angry than he is now. And our vision is really simple. We have a vision that society should work for every child. That it doesn't matter your postcode or your background or your mum or dad's income, that every child in this country should have the best chance to have the best childhood. And if that is our vision that drives what we do. And in a few moments, I'm going to tell you what the Good Childhood Report 2022 says. But here's a little sneak preview. We've been reporting children's well-being for 17 years. And every year we've reported it, it's gotten worse. So our vision and our goal for this decade is I am determined that by 2030 we'll have overturned this. I am determined that by 2030 children's lives in this country should be happier than they are today. Who's with me? Yeah? Well, please, I'm here, I hope, to put a shot of adrenaline in your arm this morning about the issues that children face and to help redouble your resolve to be part of a big movement of charities and schools and communities across the country who are saying together it's not acceptable that kids' lives are getting harder. And we are determined that by 2030, children's well-being in this country will be going up and not down. So what is our challenge in front of us? Well, it's huge. There are 4 million kids in this country in poverty. That's the population of Birmingham, Manchester, and Leeds added together. Now, let me tell you this. Those numbers, 4 million children, those numbers were calculated when there was a £20 uplift on universal credit and before we'd even heard of the term cost of living crisis. My experts tell me that without radical change from the government, for which I am not overly optimistic, we are ratcheting towards 5 million children in this country within the next 24 months. That is a disgrace, if I can use Liz Truss's words. And our research shows that the most vulnerable children in this country are living with the 7 issues in their lives. You see it in your schools all the time. It could be poverty, it could be mental health, it could be exploitation, it could be abuse, it could be grooming, it could be neglect. We know that the number of children struggling with their mental health is getting bigger, and the number of children getting support is getting smaller. And we know that parents are worried about their children's safety online, but only a fraction of a clue what the signs are or where they would go for support if they needed help. So what did my team do? Well, we're working with young people across the country. We're working to support victims of criminal and sexual exploitation and those who go missing. We are supporting unaccompanied asylum seekers and victims of human trafficking. We provide life-changing therapy and counselling for young people with their mental health. We lead the single biggest piece of research into children's well-being, which we're going to talk about in a minute, and we support young people at risk of harm through domestic violence and parental substance misuse, and we support young carers. In terms of what we do, I often say our work is like 3 concentric circles. Concentric circle number 1 is we work directly with kids. We're supporting 50,000 young people every single year through our services right around the country. So we're not a think tank, we're not a bunch of policy wonks, we do the stuff with children's lives, 50,000 of them. And then what we do is we take the learning from that work and we go further upstream to try and prevent issues arising in children's lives. So that's concentric circle number 2, our prevention work, which this year will reach 750,000 children. And then the third circle out is we work to change the systems. We work with governments, we work with politicians, we work to change the law, we work to change how government spends its money. And I'll give you a couple of quick examples of what we've done on that. The first is we changed the law on school uniform. It's not every day a chief exec of a charity gets to say they changed the law, but we did. A campaign that started with a 17-year-old boy telling us his mum had gone into debt with a loan shark to pay for a blazer led to a campaign which changed the law. And I love the fact that a 17-year-old boy's story went all the way to Windsor Castle when Her Late Majesty signed a bill that cut the cost of uniform. And I hope every one of your schools have revisited your school uniform policy on the back of it. I'll give you one other example of how we've changed things for children. Some of the most vulnerable kids in the country are young people who leave the care system. We know that there are more young people who leave care who end up on the streets homeless than any other group of young people. So we started a campaign to increase housing benefit for care leavers. And last year we were successful, and we persuaded the government to substantially increase the care leavers' housing benefit to the highest possible level, which will benefit 20,000 of the most vulnerable kids in the country. So that's what we do, 3 circles: direct work, prevention, and policy change. And what I want to try and do for a few minutes this morning is open up some of our research from this year's Good Childhood Report. Some of you may have read this report, some of you may read it every year. I would encourage you to do so, because this isn't a bunch of academics second-guessing what children think. The Good Childhood Report is the voice of children themselves, tens and tens of thousands of them. Interestingly, the government measure adults' well-being, but not children's. We do. And so the Good Childhood Report is the single biggest piece of intelligence on what children think at any time. And as I said, we've done this for 15 years. So what does this report measure? Well, what this report measures is it measures children's well-being. And why does that matter? Well, because well-being, I'm going to jump a slide. Well-being is, as the Work Centre for Wellbeing put, it's about how we're doing. You can look at objective issues in children's lives. You can look at stats on housing. You can look at stats on income. You can look at stats on GCSE and maths and English results. They're obviously objective numbers. Subjective is what a child thinks about their life. That's why well-being matters, because it's how children feel. It's how hopeful they feel about the future. And well-being matters because it impacts every area of our lives. And you know that in your own life. If we're more happy, if we're more hopeful, if we feel more secure, we're likely to be more content in our lives. And so well-being, we measure it by looking at the thoughts and feelings of young people and also how young people feel about the meaning of their life. And we ask them questions on 10 different areas of their lives. We ask them questions on their family, their home life, their friendships, their health, how they feel about time, school, money, choices, the future, and their appearance. So when I'm telling you that children's well-being is going down in this country, I mean when we weight all of those 10 areas across all of the children we measure, and we weight that into an index, that index is getting lower year after year after year. And when I tell you the number of deeply unhappy children in the United Kingdom has doubled in the last decade, I'm not talking about children having a bad day. The number of deeply unhappy children is the number who say that they are unhappy in every single one of those 10 areas of their lives. The number of children who tell us they're unhappy in every single one of those, that number has doubled in the last decade. 10 years ago, it was 174,000 children. Last year, it was 320,000 children. It's about 8%. Now just let's think about that for a second. That's almost 1 in 10 of our children, 1 in 10 of the kids in your school is deeply unhappy with every single aspect of their lives. So how do we put this report together? Well, we use 2 data sources. The first one on the right-hand side, we do our own survey every single year with tens of thousands of young people and tens of thousands of families. And the other data source, that survey is conducted in sort of April, May, June time this year. And the other survey is we use what's called the Understanding Society Survey, which is a huge survey that the government has done and is managed by the University of Essex. So we use both of those data sets to put these numbers together. So, what is the current state of children's well-being? How are children's lives? What is the research telling us? Well, it tells you that. If you look at this chart, when we started analyzing this research in 2009, you can see that the Good Childhood Index was at 8.17. Last year, it was 7.69. The trajectory is downward, and it's going to keep going downward in the years to come without change. And that is why when I tell you I am determined by 2030 that grid is starting to go up, because we cannot, as a society, allow this grid to go down any further. We just can't. So children's lives are getting harder in this country, and that is what this research is telling us. Now, there is some good news. The good news is about 80% of children are happy. And that's brilliant. The problem we have, and what this graph is showing us, is that the number of children who are unhappy is growing year after year after year. So if you look at these 4 grids, we've got children's happiness and children's well-being with 4 distinctly different areas of their lives: their friendships, their appearance, their school, and their schoolwork. The last 2 will be particularly interesting, I think, for you. Now, there's a bit of a blip. You'll see it's starting to go up a little bit on some of these. That's just 1 year. So we need 1 more year of data to see if those have turned around. So my experts tell me 1 year is not sufficient to say we've got things better. But you can see, even if you allow for the fact that there's a wee blip at the bottom, the trajectory from 10 years ago is still downward on all of those areas in children's lives. Is there a difference with gender? Well, if you look at those grids on the screen, the boys are in orange and the girls are in blue. And you'll see again that in relation to life as a whole, girls are less happy than boys, likewise with appearance, but in relation to school, girls are happier than boys. All of this is on our website. You're very welcome, or I can absolutely make my slides available as well. But those are interesting numbers, aren't they? What do those numbers mean for you as a governor, for your school? Children's happiness with their appearance, with their life, and with school. Now, what we've got going on in this slide is we ask children those questions on those 10 areas I started with. You'll recognize them down the left-hand side of that grid. Now, what our statisticians do is they analyze all of the responses, and they come up with what we call the midpoint. And generally speaking, children above the midpoint, we can say, are happy with their lives, and children below the midpoint aren't. And if you look at the orange on the right, these are the percentage of children scoring below the midpoint. So we've got 6.5% of children are unhappy with how they use time. If you go down to the bottom of the bottom 5 options, you'll see that they're most unhappy with how they feel about the future, the choices, things, appearance, and school. If I was to put last year's numbers up, the number of children below the midpoint on future was 7. So we've seen it go up by 2.5 in a year. That tells us, with all of the noise going on around us, the war in Ukraine, climate crisis, cost of living crisis, children are starting to become more anxious about the future. Things was nowhere near the bottom last year. It was way up near the top. So what that tells us is that the cost of living crisis is feeding the fact that children think they're not going to be able to have the stuff that they want. And without question, and this is really important for this audience, the top answer that children are most unhappy with, year after year after year, is school. Every year. Now, let me be very clear. They're not unhappy with school work. They're unhappy with school. That's culture. That's how they feel when they come into school. It's how they feel about their relationships with teachers. It's how they feel about their relationships with their friends and their peers. School has been the top answer that children are most unhappy with for the last 7 years. And I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on. But we also know we've been through an absolute nightmare of the last couple of years. So we asked young people some questions around the pandemic. And if you look at this chart, the orange are those scoring below the midpoint, and the yellow are those on the midpoint. So you'll see, if you look at this chart, the things that over 30% of children were either on the midpoint or below the midpoint, doing work at home, having to isolate when school was open, not seeing family, not being able to do hobbies, and the bottom answer, not being able to see their family and friends. But if you look at the bottom here, when we asked parents about the pandemic, 53% of parents believe the pandemic has had a negative or a very negative impact on their child's education. So we know that the pandemic has had a big impact on children's lives. Lots of children coped, but about 11% didn't cope at all. And I'm sure that matches the evidence from your schools and probably from your own communities. We saw it in our own organization. A child who's maybe had one parent working at home in a decent house with half-decent Wi-Fi and a computer, just about coped okay. But what about the child with a single parent who's a key worker, and that key worker's out in a hospital or portering or a nurse? What happens to that child if they haven't got the right Wi-Fi or the right computer? There is a constituency of children, 11%, who did not cope at all with the pandemic. That should say 11% over there. My slide looks like 1, sorry. It should be 11. 11% did not cope with the pandemic. Now, we have matched those 11% onto the children with the lowest well-being. So there is a group of children at the very bottom who are bumping along who neither coped with the pandemic nor have good well-being or happiness with their lives. And we're trying to say to government there is about 1 in 10 children who are deeply, deeply struggling right now. And what are you going to do about it? But here's the other information. We also ask children what they're worried about. Now look at those for a second. So anything from the yellow left is worried. 75% of children are worried about the environment. That's why your green governance thing you talked about at the beginning, Emma, is bang on the money. Children bluntly think we're screwing up their planet, and they'd be right. And they see no leadership from anybody on this. So please, if you're showing leadership in your schools on the environment, children are going to love you because they're really concerned about this. Now, look at the second issue they're worried about. 70% of children are worried about pandemics. Now, that was nowhere on the scale 2-3 years ago. Now it's the second biggest issue children are worried about. I was talking to an education minister, I can't remember which one, probably about 17 ago, I was trying to get across to him that 2 years is a hell of a long time for a 10-year-old. He goes, oh, Mark, it's only 2 years. I go, no, think how long it was from one Christmas to the next when you were 11 years old. Now it goes past in like 30 minutes. The morning schools closed in Hampshire. I was in Morrison's, round the corner from where I live. It's before I became a governor of the high school where I live. And the kids in front of me in the queue were all wearing the high school uniform. And they were having a conversation about what was going on around them. And of course, as an adult, you can't possibly intervene. But I was listening intently to that conversation in the queue. Now, if somebody told me when I was 10 years old, 11, 12 years old, that I was going to have months of unscheduled holiday with no school, I might have thought every Christmas had landed at once. But these children were scared. Their brains were melting. Nothing they'd ever experienced in their lives was preparing them for what was going on around them. They were terrified. And then thankfully, one of them, a young man called Jack, clocked me, and he's our neighbor. And he was, Mark. He said, you work for a children's charity, don't you? I said, yeah. He looked at me with really scared face. He goes, is it going to be okay? I said, yes, Jack, it's going to be fine. We're going to do what the government tell us, and we're going to follow the government's rules. If only the government had followed the government's rules. We're going to follow the government's rules, and we're going to do what they tell us, and it's going to be okay. And his little face changed. It is really hard to overstate the impact of a fear of this happening again in children's lives, which is why it's a second answer. Now, the other answer that's ratcheted up the scale is refugee and migrant crisis. It wasn't there 2 years ago. So you can see the impacts of Afghanistan, the impacts of Ukraine, the impacts of the boats landing on our shores every other day. That has now become a big issue that children are worried and concerned about. So as you look at that list down the left-hand side, that is what the children in your school are worried about. They're worried about the environment, pandemics, crime, inequality, the migrant crisis, online safety, homelessness, and unemployment. But then, to add another level to this, in 2020, the Good Childhood Report showed that children's well-being in the United Kingdom was the worst in all Europe. So we analysed 14 European countries, from Scandinavia to Portugal, and all the way across to Greece. We wanted to know, how did our children cope by comparison? Ladies and gentlemen, our children are the most unhappy in Europe. So we wanted to know why that was. And so we deep dived into that. And there are two reasons why British children are more unhappy than anybody else. Number one, our children have got the highest fear of failure in all of Europe. Now, we've got to ask questions about our education system, but why children are so scared to fail. And also because children look at the news and see the average price of a house is 10 times the average salary, and they go, how am I going to afford somewhere to live when I leave school? And secondly, we have the highest levels of child poverty in all of Europe. And those two issues are the reason why our children are the most unhappy in all of Europe. Now, every year in the Good Childhood Report, we pick an issue to deep dive into. And fortuitously, for you, this year, the issue we wanted to dive into was children's happiness in school. And so what we've done is we've done a deep dive with children to ask them lots of questions about their school lives, to try and understand how they feel. So, if you look at the graph in front of you, what that graph is showing us is children's happiness with schoolwork by age. So if you look, the bottom one, the orange, is 14 to 16-year-olds. And that's the area that's showing the greatest drop. Even taken together over the last 10 years, children's happiness with schoolwork has got worse. But by far, 14 to 16-year-olds have got worse. What that shows us is the older children get, the more unhappy they're becoming with their schoolwork. You'll remember earlier I talked about the midpoint as the point above which children are happy, below which they're not. We wanted to ask, generally speaking, how happy are you with school? You'll see, these are below the midpoint scores. You'll see that there are more girls below the midpoint, so more girls are unhappy. You'll see that the most unhappy cohorts are key stages 3 and 4. You'll see that ethnic minorities have a higher score. You'll see that kids with SEND have got a higher score, and you'll see young carers have a higher score. In other words, we can see very clearly from this the constituencies of children who are struggling the most with school. So let you look at that for a second and think about your own school and where it sits on those different key stages and what those numbers mean for you. But we also asked children about different areas of school life. And again, it's back to that model of below the midpoint. So the issues that the children are most concerned about in school: schoolwork, and look at the bottom one, feeling listened to. The good news is, on the most part, children feel safe, which is excellent. But the number of children who feel not heard and not listened to is the highest number on that grid. How are children listened and heard in your school? "76% say there are good things we can do outside school," which is great. 75% think there's one adult in my school I can talk to. That's good. 71% young people get on well together. 71% I think the realistic what school's asking of me. 70% of adults are interested in my well-being. 70% think my school is helping me develop the skills I need. These are good numbers. That's good. But there we go at the bottom, 57. I have a say in decisions that are important to me at school. These are some quotes from the survey. I don't think they actually listen to what the students say. They just have them, i.e. the opportunity to speak, when they have them. They won't care if you're going through stuff or anything. They still expect you to do all the work you're given to a good standard. If you didn't get enough sleep because there's something going on at home or wherever, if you go in, it's a really good, if a teacher, it helps. So children don't feel heard and don't feel listened to in school. We also wanted to know what parents thought. And so we asked parents about what they were struggling with in terms of school cost. And you'll see a third of parents are worried about the cost of school trips, a third are worried about the cost of school uniform, and a third are worried about the cost of school shoes, and 30% or 29% computer equipment. Now bear in mind, these were numbers that were done in April and May. And look at that number on the right-hand side. In April and in May, 85% of parents were worried about the cost of living crisis. What do you think that number might be now? 90? 95? We have a lot of parents who are really anxious, and we all know, and you know, as leaders of schools, that children absorb their parents' angst. And if parents are worried, children will be worried. And if children are worried, they're not going to perform as well at school as they should do and could do. But I wonder if you thought about measuring well-being in your school. The Good Childhood Index is a list of questions. We will give it to you for free. You're very welcome to have it. If you email research@children'ssociety.org.uk, 2 S's in the middle, Children's Society, research@children'ssociety.org.uk, we will send you the Good Childhood Index. And you can use it in your school. My school uses it in Hampshire, which allows you to plot your number every year and see how children's happiness is in your school. We've worked with St Helens Council to measure well-being in schools in St Helens, and St Helens Council have used the results of that to change their entire strategy for the borough. In Manchester, there's a huge big project called Be Well, which is measuring children's well-being right across Greater Manchester. And in Newcastle, we've been measuring it in schools right across Gateshead and Sunderland. But I want to encourage you to encourage your executive team to measure children's well-being. So we're not working... what gets measured gets managed, as somebody once told me. Data counts. So what does children's well-being actually look like in your school? And how can your school and you as leaders promote a good childhood for all? Well, I believe that schools are a massive part of children's lives and a massive part of communities. And schools are ideally placed to support children with their mental health and with their well-being. I believe school leaders should make well-being and mental health a strategic priority, working with governors, leaders, mental health leads, and auditing what's taking place, which could involve using the Good Childhood Index, so you can understand what well-being looks like in your school. If you haven't already, I would encourage you to write and publish a well-being policy for pupils and for staff that's evidence-led, based upon the needs of the school, and regularly reviewed. And all other policies, like behaviour, bullying, school exclusion, should be measured against the well-being policy. We've just done that in the school that I'm a part of, to understand that behaviour, that sometimes the behavioural issue is a direct result of low well-being or poor mental health, and not just a child wanting to cause trouble. There are grants available from local authorities and from the DFE to train specialist mental health leads in schools. And I would encourage you to encourage your staff to have a whole school approach to mental health and well-being. That is a thread that runs through the school, like as important as maths and English. And that you as governors take a lead in ensuring that pupils' and staff well-being is championed, understood, and supported, to ensure that a culture of well-being grows in your school, and that schools have the resources they need, even with all the other demands on the budget, so that more doesn't land on teachers. Some years ago, we did some research about the 5 ways of well-being for schools, and we've got them on the screen there, about connecting, being active, being creative, learning, and taking notice. And schools can use those 5 ways of well-being in their daily lives. But also encouraging pupils to speak openly about their struggles, to build relationships of trust between children and staff, so that teachers, often by being vulnerable themselves and sharing how they struggle with mental health, can open the doors for young people to feel that they can do too. And we know from our work that there is real power in informal support, in listening, and in giving pupils safe spaces to talk about how they feel. We need to train our teachers to support the signs that a child is struggling, and to know the ways in which they can signpost that child to get the right support. Because we know that they can't rely on the NHS. Children in different parts of the country are waiting up to 300 days from the moment they are diagnosed with a mental health issue to they're able to be seen by a specialist. But also that schools recognise the connection between well-being and poverty, well-being and other areas of disadvantage, and to find ways to support children who are living with multiple disadvantages in their lives. Now, we know that life is too hard for too many children. We know that. And you can see from our research, and you'll know it from your schools, we can see the scale of the challenge facing us. On my desk at home is a quote from a 17th century American philosopher called Frederick Douglass. He said, "It's better for society to build stronger children than fix broken adults." And I think he was right. Ladies and gentlemen, I know I'm preaching to the choir. I know I am. But this country needs to value its children a lot more than it does right now. And that needs to be backed up with leadership in politics and public expenditure. Gordon Brown was right. Children are 20% of our present and 100% of our future. And right now, we are failing too many children in this country. Right now, you're going to be facing unparalleled tough choices. Jeremy Hunt talks about tough choices. I'll tell you what a tough choice looks like. A tough choice looks like when you've got a limited amount of money in your budget. Do you spend it on mental health support or ensuring you've got the right number of teachers in the classroom? I'll tell you what a tough choice looks like, Mr. Hunt. It's a mum trying to work out whether she can afford to eat herself or put the kettle on. Those are the tough choices, Chancellor, not the ones you're facing. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to do better for our children in this country. So what needs to change? Well, I can tell you that there has been a decade-long cuts in children's support services around the country. It would take £2.5 billion tomorrow just to fill the hole that austerity has taken out. And we've cut early support for children by a half. 88% of all mental health support is now spent on crisis interventions, not early interventions. We need to change that, so we're supporting children early with their mental health and with their well-being. I actually believe the government's strategy for levelling up is absolutely right. But the metric for levelling up is not higher GCSE maths results. The metric for levelling up is happier children by 2030. And I will work hard to persuade the government that they should measure children's well-being, and that should be their metric for children's happiness. We have to get on top of child poverty. As the cost of living crisis bites, it's going to get worse. Did anyone see the story in The Observer the other week? It broke my heart. Of a wee boy going to school and sitting in the corner of the dining hall with an empty lunchbox and pretending to eat so he wouldn't be embarrassed in front of the teachers or his friends that his mum had no food in the house. What's that mean for your kitchen staff when a child gets to the end of the till and hasn't got any money on their card? And ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry, but if I hear one more minister telling me the solution is to get people into work, I think I might actually scream. My mum told me when I was a wee boy that a sign of old age was yelling at the television. I have done a lot of that in recent months. There was a minister on the telly box the other night said, we will have to get people off benefits and into work, and I'm yelling at the television. Minister, read your own statistics. 3/4 of all people on universal credit are working full-time jobs. We need a strategy to address child poverty. And right now, my team are going to work overtime to persuade Rishi Sunak to honour the commitment he made when he was Chancellor to uprate benefits in line with inflation. And we need our care system to work for children so that we ensure that the children we have who are looked after have the best possible start in life. We must fight racism and prejudice and intolerance wherever we find it, because we know that black children are more likely to live in poor housing, have lower educational attainment, have bad experience with justice, and we have to level up for all children of colour in this country. And we need to radically reform our education system so it works for all children, not just some. We have to do better for children with SEND, and we need to ensure that every child has the best possible start in life. Bluntly, above all else, we actually just need our government to have a plan for children. We've heard from your chief exec earlier, we've had the SEND review, the white paper, the green paper, this paper, that paper. We need a strategy that joins us all up. What does good childhood look like in 21st century Britain? The government see children as 3 Ps, pupils, patients, and prisoners. We need a strategy that puts children's happiness first. I believe we need a cabinet minister for children who will lead to ensure that our children have the best start in life. I have a policy of never talking about children without telling you about a child. So let me tell you about Taylor. Taylor's mum was in and out of mental health units when she was growing up. And when Taylor was 11, her mum was sectioned permanently. Her father wasn't around, and Taylor lived with her grandparents. Just after she moved in with her grandparents, her granddad died. And this young girl was living in this vortex of pain, difficulty, and sadness. And it wasn't long before people started to take advantage of her. She was desperate for affection and got into a relationship which turned toxic. Her boyfriend was manipulative and controlling. She started to miss school. She was sleeping all day. She was going on binges, and her life was in a meltdown and didn't know how to stop. Taylor's school reached out to one of our team, who found a way to mentor her and support her. And my colleague Gemma worked with Taylor for over a year, helping her understand why her life had got into this situation and how she could help herself out. And we got Taylor back into school. Taylor passed her exams and now wants to be a social worker. And if you met Taylor today, you'd think she'd come a long way. She's chatty, she's confident, and you'd never know the journey she's been on. And that's what happens when schools notice the issues in children's lives and help them get the right support and help them turn their lives around. I used to believe I was an optimist. Trust me, growing up in Belfast, you learn to be one quite quickly. And then I read an article by a writer called Rebecca Solnit, who said that optimists and pessimists have the same thing in common. Both believe they don't have to do anything at all. The optimist doesn't do anything because everything will get better. And the pessimist doesn't do anything because it'll always get worse. Solnit argues the world is only ever transformed by hope-filled people. People who dare to believe that their actions, their activities, their voices, their choices, their behavior can change the world. I want to tell you this morning, the reason I've got up at 5:30 to be here with you is because I want to say thank you for being a hope-filled person who hasn't sat back and looked at the situation and gone, I hope somebody else sorts that. You've volunteered, you've put yourself forward, you've decided to help your community, and I think you're amazing and you're heroes, and I want to say thank you for being a hope-filled person who dares to believe that your skills and your talents and your energy can bring change to your school and change to your community. So I dare to challenge you to do even more, to fight even harder to get children the start in life that they deserve. That every child, regardless of their postcode or their parents' income, that every child should live in a decent home, be surrounded by people who love them, be free from violence or abuse, that they should have enough heat in the radiator and enough food on their table, to be able to be the best versions of themselves, free from prejudice, free from racism, to walk tall and achieve their dreams. And until that day, I promise I will stand with you and use my voice and the voice of my organization to build that society that works for all children, to ensure that every child can thrive, not just survive, and where every child has a good childhood. Thank you for listening.